Hey, friends, welcome to the Permission to Be podcast. Before we get started with our conversation with Dr. Amy Kinney, I'd want to just take some space and maybe welcome anybody new who this might be their first episode that they're tuning into the podcast. My name is Tommy, and I want to um, maybe make some connections. And by the end of the time that I'm sharing, you'll be well oriented into who we are and how we're coming into the conversation today. And so these are, how you have conversations and then you reflect back on them and you, in hindsight, can see a theme developing. Well, these are just some disjointed and emerging thoughts from our last 4 conversations and a little preview of what's to come in our next few conversations. In the way that I'm organizing these thoughts in particular helps me ground in the reason that I'm having these conversations to help me show up authentically in the world. And so I love being here on Permission to Be. For me, it's really a beautiful opportunity to publicly not know. We have some really beautiful conversations on here, but I think with a deep spirit of humility and curiosity. We love to dig into policy and societal contracts. We believe that we make the world better through imagination, reimagining what family could be like, community, work, our relationship to the earth. And in doing these things, I think we're finding healing. And if healing's a difficult word for you, maybe improvement in material conditions, both individually and collectively. And so the hope is that you find something in these conversations that we have here on the podcast that can help guide you in the next best step in whatever your context might be. Whether that's in your spiritual communities, your local communities where you live, your workspaces, around the dinner table, or for yourself. And so if I was to contextualize the last 4 conversations that we had, it might flow under a series called Bodies and Humanity, where we discussed agency and dignity through the lens of decolonization with Constanza Eliana Chinea and embodiment with Dr. Hilary McBride. We got to the honor of listening to Lisa Sharon Harper share narrative with us, this ancient sacred practice of storytelling through her book Fortune. And just as she shared so generously her history and story and how that intersects with her faith and how her body moves through the world. And also we got to talk with Dr. Christina Cleveland on identity and faith and liberation through a shifting lens of God and how those things interact. And now I think we're here in the next 4 conversations, which are grounding us in the story of now. And when I mean the story of now, I mean the continual movement of white supremacy, exploitation, and devastation through capitalism, economic injustice, the injustice done to our bodies, and the way we have organized ourselves into systems. Right now, in a lot of people's mind, if you live in the United States of America, is our bodily autonomy. But that's probably on your mind even if you don't live in the United States of America, because we're all connected. And white supremacy isn't isolated. And so our next few conversations are going to talk about the political and spiritual implications of the now, and what the liberation of the body could look like practically, tangibly on the ground. And again, it's our hope that you will be able to take away some nuggets that will help you in your context. We're going to talk to people like Dr. Aubrey Hendricks, as he has studied evangelical Christianity and his rise in political ranks as we look at how government is structured. We'll have an illuminating conversation with Andre Henry, my dear friend. And then we'll reveal our live conversation that we had with Dr. Robin Henderson Espinoza and Anna Galladay, as we talk about embodiment in politics explicitly as it relates to our democracy here in a U.S. context. But that is also a conversation that was influenced by a global worldview. So today, Dr. Amy Kinney is going to kick us off as we talk about disability justice. I am so excited because this conversation just really gave me pause in how I'm showing up in my relationships and caring for people. And I hope that it'll do the same for you. In this episode, there are maybe one or two longer pauses in between the conversation. I just want to invite you to notice during those moments what's coming up for you. If you are not subscribed to the Permission to Be newsletter, we would love to continue to build community with you. I know that's a conversation Olivia and Becka and I are having regularly about how can we engage and make this even more meaningful. The conversations with our guests have been so life-giving and truly transformed me in how I live into the world, and I would love to continue to build on that with the people who listen to the podcast. So feel free to interact with us on social media, sign up for the newsletter. If you want to give financial support, you can join our Patreon community, which I get to host. That's patreon.com/Tommy Allgood. And then, as we're growing, as we're continuing this journey with you, as things emerge, we're going to keep looking for ways to connect, ways to take the next best step, ways to pause, ways to be. I'm so glad you're here. See you on the other side.
Hello, and welcome to Permission to Be.
Let's hit him with the remix.
Oh, well, y'all got to change that.
Yes.
What do we do?
We leave our F-bombs in, and
Let's tell some stories.
As long as white people are bound, the people in power are bound, they're going to keep us bound to the same thing that they're bound to.
Out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks, and I think out of the overflow of the spirit, the body does.
Challenge some narratives.
Why is that the best that God could offer you?
Mike made it very clear that he did not want to get any of these questions beforehand. So he is getting this question live, raw, for the very first time.
This is
And I feel like art is the expression of the heart where words fail.
raw,
Oh my goodness, I have tears. Oh, y'all are killing it.
unfiltered,
I feel like that's gotta sound strange.
permission to be.
Actually, my literary agent, when we were talking about what book might I write, he was like, I mean, A Black Man with Hope is an interesting book.
Oh, shit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Permission to Be. We are honored to have with us Dr. Amy Kinney. She is a disabled scholar and a Shakespeare lecturer who hates Hamlet. Her work has been featured in Teen Vogue, The Mighty, and Roxane The Audacity. But the biggest thing and the most important thing one of the most important things you need to know is that this May, and hopefully you'll be hearing this conversation around the same time, but specifically May 17th, her brand new book titled My Body is Not a Prayer Request, Disability Justice in the Church will be released. And y'all, I have spent the afternoon reading Amy's work in different articles, and the way she writes it will draw you in and it will make you sit up and pay attention. And I just want to encourage you to make sure you go ahead, if we release this a little bit before, pre-order her book. Of course, local bookstores are always what we encourage, but you can go to the Empire, Amazon, and get it as well. Welcome.
Well, the honor is mine. I'm so excited to be here, and I can already tell that we're going to have a lively and joyful conversation.
We are so glad. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Oh, Tommy, you want to do our check-in?
Yeah. So I'm just really enjoying that this season of the podcast is completely different. We have always struggled to figure out what is the thing how do we want to bring in the conversation. And in seasons 1 and 2, it was never with any consistency, but it was who do you want to play you in your biopic?
Oh, yeah.
But you can answer that if you want to. If something comes up, you have more time to think about it. But let's be very human with each other and just how are you coming in? We just all share how are we coming into the space tonight? And does anybody want to go first?
I'll go first. I'm coming in honestly a little punchy. It's been a busy week and some stressful things, nothing dire, but a lot. And so I'm coming in a punchy in good way, giggly and just kind of joyful and super excited just to be here with everybody. That's not, sometimes I come in just kind of feeling okay, we can do this. But tonight I'm let's hang out. Let's be with each other. So, Olivia.
I'm coming in writer's mode. So I left one writing class coming into this podcast. And prior to that writing class, I was reading Amy's stuff. And so my writer's brain is just kind of kicking, firing on all cylinders. But that brings me joy. Writing is my great joy. So I feel joyful.
Amy, did you want to go?
Yeah, I think I'm coming in tingly with excitement and hope, which is sort of a dangerous feeling because sometimes that can lead to disappointment, but it can also lead to change and to revolution. So I think tingly is what I feel in my body.
I love that. I especially love when someone leads in with sensation. I'm really trying to be attuned to that. So I'm coming in. I think today's been so kind of a roller coaster of emotions between meetings, but also like in conversations with friends. And so I'm holding both deep tensions in some ways, but also like a really fun day full of laughter. And but it's been going on for 10 hours now, so I'm a little also like feel my body like kind of grounding in and winding down, which I'm excited for the journey tonight of where this conversation is going to take us. And I'm really curious about why Hamlet gets the hate.
I think a better question is, why wouldn't he? Ooh. He hates women. He's mean to his mom.
Come on.
He spends the whole play droning on about his first world problems. It's so hard, you're a prince. Sorry, mate. No.
Yes. Oh, I think that just gets us started, right? That's like right on par for a lot of men today.
I was like, talk about United States white cis men. I mean, that just like...
And that's exactly why the Academy likes Hamlet so much, right? Is he mirrors a lot of what is valued in the Academy, talking about things you have no knowledge of, extending lots of bigotry and hatred and misogyny and ableism and racism towards other folks. So it's no wonder that Hamlet is a favorite, but I just have no space for him or for anyone who adores him so much.
Wow. Okay, so this is our first time getting to talk to each other, and this is maybe our audience's first time being able to interact with you, but why don't you just take up some space and introduce yourself, who you are, and whatever else you want to say.
Wow, who I am. What a big question. Ooh. I, in this moment, am someone who is listening to the wisdom of my disabled body and has learnt so much from my disabled body. I cherish her and think that she is a gift and not the villain narrative or the lost narrative or the sin narrative that so many people have given me. I am someone who cares deeply about the co-flourishing of my neighbors who are unhoused in my community. I live in an area of California that has both wealth and with that obviously poverty and wealth inequity. And I care so deeply about valuing our neighbors who are unhoused as image bearers and giving them the resources that they deserve. And they're often forgotten and dismissed in conversations about church or equity or just being a neighbor. I believe deeply in my gut that God is love and that we are all divine, and that together we get to witness the canvas of creation and the beautiful biodiversity of creation through witnessing how each of us bear God's image.
Amy, can you tell us about what led to the decision to write this book? Why this book? Why now? Tell us about, what was behind that.
I didn't plan to write a book. I joined a writing group not thinking I was a writer, which in retrospect sounds like a silly thing to say. But I joined the writing group really just to process some of my own experiences as a disabled person in church. And I had a lot of spiritual abuse and religious trauma, as many disabled people do in church spaces. And I wanted a way to process that wasn't shaming people, or that wasn't, that would be listened to, because so often it had been silenced or just dismissed in every church I've been in. And over the course of sharing bits of my story, the group, yourself included, Olivia, were just so encouraging and so welcoming of what I had to say. And I had never really experienced that before. That when I had shared, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. Are you telling me that when we started this, you didn't consider yourself a writer?
No, not at all. I joined the group.
This expression, I know that our audience cannot see this expression on my face. For somebody, I wrote with Amy every week for over a year, and her essay skills are so exceptional. So this shock is that it's just baffling to me that she didn't see herself that way. That's amazing. And so please continue. Wow.
Yeah, I joined the group when a friend had sent it to me and said, this could be a great space for you to process some of your story and some of your trauma. And so it definitely was, but it was much more than that. And I think through the reflections of the group and the encouragement of the group, that led to me sharing pieces of my story with broader audiences. And then that led to the book. And the book is really an invitation for people to rethink some of the assumptions they have about disability. In my experience, most people haven't given disability much thought. And when they have, it's through pity or shaming narratives. And so I wanted to really give an invitation to folks to rethink what they have heard and learned about disability, and to demonstrate the ways that disability is a gain.
I read your article, the Huffington Post article about people grieving and pitying for you. And I just wanted to read a couple of sentences that just kind of leaped off the page, and then just have you comment on that. So you were talking about people when you were diagnosed as a teenager, and people grieving the future that you weren't going to have, things that you weren't even necessarily thinking about at that young age. And you said, there are enough injustices for disabled people in the U.S. right now without borrowing from tomorrow's griefs. Grieve for that. And then a few sentences down, you say, my wheelchair is the key to unlocking the floodgates of pity. And then you go on to list several things that about which I was unaware, that just really made me stand up and take notes. So could you kind of comment on that and unpack that and share what led to, what was the lead up to that, and share with our audience some of the things that you talked about that are grief worthy that many people may not even know anything about?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Grief is tricky and slippery because in the moment it can feel loving, but I think it is often a spiritual bypassing that situates the issue in an individual's pain or body, my body, instead of thinking about the systemic problems of ableism. And everyone wants to, not everyone, a lot of people want to cry for me, want to pat me on the head like I'm a good dog. They want to tell me, especially when I was a kid, I would receive a lot of, you'll never walk down the aisle. Okay. I mean, I'm a child. I'm not really thinking about that. I'm thinking about reading and imagining new worlds and creating and playing and stuff, you know. Or I would receive just these statements about the future of my life would be really hard, as though just by virtue of being disabled, it would somehow be harder than a non-disabled person's. And in some ways that's true, but it then puts it back on me and my body instead of saying, let's change that. Let's change the parts of our society that are disabling. Let's change the parts that are ableist. Right now, disabled people in the United States don't have marriage equality. We don't have minimum wage protection. Many polling places are not accessible. Disabled people are underpaid or live in poverty as a result of there being caps on how much money people can have when they receive disability. It takes longer to actually go through the paperwork process to receive disability than many people can actually survive. And so tens of thousands of people die waiting to even learn if they are approved for disability payments. And then, of course, many are not. And maybe we should grieve for those things and not just grieve. We should change them. We should change them with our actions and our activism and our community work. Instead of crying over me using a wheelchair, let's change the fact that disabled people are often murdered by their caregivers and parents and loved ones because we're considered burdens.
I so resonate with what you're saying in that we don't fully grasp ableism and also the disabled experience. Not that there's one, like Black people aren't a monolith, disabled people aren't a monolith. Just very I was a nurse I am a registered nurse, and I was working at the bedside through the pandemic. And I just hit this place of deep burnout. And, the job kind of promises you that you have these benefits that you can use, and they're labeled like short-term disability benefits and whatnot. And it was for my mental health at this point. I recognized I was not able to show up for my patients in a way that was fully honoring to their humanity. I think Dr. Lisa Rankin labels that as I was experiencing, now I have the language to say I was experiencing this moral injury. But to take time off, the amount of doctors that I would have had to see, the amount of appointments that I would have had to go through, and then on top of that, trying to navigate life, get on medication for my depression at the time. And I'm like, why is it like this? Why can't we just say we need help and we get the help that we need, right? There's a statement of that we care, but in practice, when it boils down to it, our actions are not showing that we care. It's actually showing the opposite. It's showing that we're a unit of production, and we have to, we value more bodies that can produce more under a capitalist construct. And so I love what you're talking about as you're both unpacking the depths of which, because it's really easy for me also as a queer person who presents as male to go, oh, there's marriage equality but you're really thinking in these systemic terms. Would you like to kind of talk more about that?
Yeah, I think capitalism is one of the huge problems because it says that the more that you produce, the more that you are worthy. And it sells us the lie that we are only worthy of rest when we have produced enough. We don't earn our rest. We shouldn't have to perform our worth. Each of us are inherently worthy. And disabled people can't keep up in a capitalist system because we are viewed as drains on the system because we don't work enough, or we can't produce enough to prove our worthiness. Now, of course, the lie beneath that is that none of us can survive in a capitalist system. It's just that some of us can kind of fool ourselves for longer that we can.
Amy, one of the things that you mentioned when you were speaking earlier, and it was also noted in your HuffPost article that I had never heard of, Disability Day of Mourning March 1st, a day that memorializes disabled people killed by their parents or caregivers. The day is not just about remembering those who were murdered, but draws attention to the harmful ways this violence is often minimized. I gasped audibly when I read that. I did not know, I've never heard of Disability Day of Mourning, and I certainly did not know that there was a pattern or an issue or a trend of disabled people being murdered by their caregivers. I would just love to hear you say a little bit more about that or unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, even the fact that it isn't well known speaks to the ableism of the system, I think, because there's a type of erasure of whose story gets to be told and whose histories we get to know. And I experience the same thing whenever I talk about churches fighting against the ADA, and churches don't have to follow the ADA still in this country. And the general response from folks is shock and almost as though they don't believe it. And not in a gaslighting sense that they're trying to say that doesn't exist, but just they can't believe people would be that mean to disabled people because they have been taught about disability through pity, and they haven't really thought about how we've been segregated in so many ways from society, or they haven't really thought about how maybe they don't know disability history as well as they would assume. Disability Day of Mourning is particularly tragic because, as you read just then, the way that non-disabled parents are described in the media is often with a lot of sympathy. And it's talked about that non-disabled parents who kill, or caregivers or guardians who kill their disabled children are considered justified in some ways, or mercy is often used, mercy killing, or there's often a way, even just in the way the story is told, to suggest that, well, the disabled person took a lot of work, so we can kind of understand someone snapping. You know, it's told as though we are sympathizing with the murderer because disabled people are a burden and a drain and a waste.
I'm just so struck by, you know, we've gone through collectively, and I'm just noticing the ableistness of what I was about to say, a pandemic. We're still in the midst of a global pandemic. And we've gone through a major global uprising that I think we haven't seen since the gay rights, civil rights era. And earlier today I was sitting in a panel interview commemorating Marsha P. Johnson, and just I'm struck with Martin Luther King Jr. says that talks about being inextricably bound together, referencing liberation. I'm just struck by how inextricably bound the struggle is here to see and honor each other's humanity. And one of the things that as I was reading some of your essays and articles today, one of the things that I was really struck by was this tender but forceful call to start to focus on the person, the whole person, and not just in reducing the person to an illness or the thing that maybe happened to them. And I don't really have necessarily a question out of that. I'm really as much as I'm wanting to maybe dialogue a little bit about this invitation into seeing each other's humanity.
Tender but forceful. I'll take it. I think so often when people approach me, my body becomes public property. I am an object. I'm a mascot. I'm a token. I am inspiration porn and to be pitied. And all of those are centering someone else, and I become consumed and only for the pleasure and purpose of their edification or their kind of desire, whatever they want to make me out to be, I become. And that's obviously unfair to me because I am so much more than any of those things. And I'm so much more than a diagnosis. I contain multitudes. But also, it is really harmful to the non-disabled person in that interaction who's doing that as well, because it suggests that some people are disposable, and it suggests that there's a hierarchy of humanity. There's no hierarchy. We are all bound together, bound to one another, to use the phrase, Tommy, that you used, because our thriving is dependent on one another. This myth of independence that we have here that says that one person can strive and work hard enough and produce enough to become wealthy and kind of equip themselves with distancing themselves from all pain and suffering of the world. No, that's horrible. And that is only by way of violence and erasure of people more marginalized than that person. And I think something really important about disability wisdom is that it highlights interdependence and the ways that we are all dependent on one another for our survival, but also to create new worlds where we can all flourish instead of living in these toxic systems that we're a part of now.
You mentioned at the outset one area where this really intersects is housing justice. And you're in California. So anytime I hear somebody go, I'm from California, I'm like, ain't no way and on God's green earth that I could ever afford to live in California. But I'm also thinking about like the Charlotte area, where I live here, Charlotte, North Carolina. We've had, we're having kind of corporations come in and buy up property and drive the housing value up, which is increasing the instance of people being unhoused and not having access to housing. So what are some, in your work, what are you finding some tangible ways that we can start to show up in this interdependent way, especially as it relates to like housing justice?
There was a study done in the county that I live in that gave us some numbers about how much we already pay, we being taxpayers, how much we already pay to keep people unhoused. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was something to the tune of we pay $100,000 per chronically unhoused person to keep them unhoused at this time. And that connects everything from medical fees to city officials, to law enforcement interactions, to sanitation, all of the money that is spent basically on each individual who is currently unhoused in our county. And then if we were to give permanent supportive housing, it would only be about $56,000 per year per person who is unhoused. So we're paying about double to keep people unhoused per person per year right now. The only thing that really explains that is stigma and bigotry towards people experiencing homelessness. And so I think any ways that we can support permanent supportive housing initiatives in our communities are great. And that's a really broad view, but on the micro level, I think it looks like showing up and listening to the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness. So I'm involved in my community, a small group of us really practice this by going to the laundromat with about 30 to 40 of our unhoused neighbors, doing laundry together, eating pizza together, or going to the park and hanging out. And it's led by what they tell us their needs are. So they'll say, we need tampons, or we need tops, or we need bike repair kits. And that's what we bring. And there's so much mutual flourishing in that, because we're not going there pitying them or thinking that we have answers and they need them, or even handing out some sort of religious tracts or forcing them to listen to some sort of religious ceremony before giving them support. No, we're showing love through clean clothes, full bellies, and a gentle listening ear.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the religious tracts, and so I want to segue us a little bit into your experience of the church, Big C Church, or individual church's role. Your upcoming book, which may be released by the time we have this conversation, our audience gets to hear it, but is My Body Is Not a Prayer Request. So I would love for you to dive into that just a little bit, or a lot. Bring it all.
The title is a clapback, really, to people assuming that my body is a prayer request and coming up to me and praying for me to be cured, telling me things like, God told me to pray for you, or the Spirit led me to tell you that you're to be healed, or what sin is preventing you from walking. People, so from the time I was 11 to the time I was 17 or so, every Sunday at church, pastors and elders would gather, lay hands on me, pray for me to be cured. And that really does something to a kid.
Whoa.
It gives you a large therapy bill as an adult.
Wow. It's almost as if again, it's kind of the solidarity piece of that I'm experiencing is almost like you went through this version of conversion therapy. And I'm just struck by what I know about trauma, what I know about finding belonging, how that begins to restructure even the brain and how we perceive things. So how would you like to share about that experience? And I guess I also want to preface.
I wouldn't recommend it.
and I just want to say to the audience, to be with your bodies, as you know, we're talking very openly about shame. We're talking about, you know, we will find ourselves somewhere in this conversation where we've perpetuated ableism. And the purpose of this conversation is not to come at an angle of judgment, but we can't begin to build anew until we address what the practices are that are causing the harm.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's sitting with that discomfort, just like most of us who grew up in a supremacy culture at some level are racist, those of us who are able-bodied, because it's not about intention to harm. It's about the culture. What, Amy, you talked about is the systems we live in, which is not an excuse, but it's an awareness we need to carry with us as an openness.
Absolutely. And they're all mutually reinforcing. Ableism is really the idea that some bodies are better than others. And so that is connected to anti-Blackness. That's connected to queerphobia. That's connected to fat phobia. And that's why I think it's so important for us to think about, you can't be wanting liberation in one area and not others. They're all interconnected. They all mutually enforce one another. And also recognizing the privilege and the experience that each of us bring with the complexity of our identities. So as a white disabled woman who is cishet, I have a lot of privilege. And I have experienced a lot of ableism in the church. And I say that just as an invitation to think about how much the more for people who are more multiply marginalized than I am as well. So the experience of being prayed for. So It was always, I'll back up. I had that experience of being prayed for pretty much every Sunday at church. And there's so many power dynamics there. They were adults. I was a child. They were all men. I was a young girl. They were non-disabled. I was disabled. So there's a lot of different power differentials that I think often aren't taken into play. So I'm not sure that consent can even really be given when there's so much of a power distribution in that way. But even since then, I'm no longer 17. And since then, I have been prayed for dozens of times by people who I want to think are well-meaning and have just been led to believe that disability is bad or tragic or sinful. And so this looks like people approaching me at church or at Target or anywhere and saying, "Hi, I'm a Christian. I want to pray for you," or "God told me to pray for you." And I didn't do this as a child, but I now as an adult say, "I'm good, thanks," or "No, thank you." And often that's not enough to deter them. Often they pray anyway, or I've been held down to be prayed for. I've had people put potions on me that they've made to cure me. And all of this is really rooted in an idea of disability as bad and sinful, yes, but also of this notion that my consent doesn't matter in these scenarios, because if God tells you to do something, in their kind of version of what's happening, if God tells you to do something, that somehow supersedes what any sinful, using air quotes there, what any sinful human could say. And so that matters more than the consent of a disabled girl or a now disabled woman.
Wow. I'm just noticing a welling up as you articulate the experience of being physically held down. What a deep violation of your humanity and agency. I'm so sorry that has been your experience, and just that we have to do better. We have to do better. And yes. I'm just thinking, I didn't even know that earlier you had mentioned that churches are fighting against the Americans with Disability Act, and that they don't even. It's connecting to me now that in my place of that I call my spiritual home, we're aware of areas of opportunity that we need to make, the stage needs to be accessible. And that all sends a message, right? That sends a message of like, who is God speaking to or speaking through, right? Or who are we valuing in this regard? And so not to, I guess, get all into the details of the book, but what are specifically for people who call themselves or identify with the Christian faith? So much of your trauma has been rooted in that, what I'm hearing. What is something that we need to do now in the context of 2022 to foster this solidarity?
I think one of the most important things is to learn from disabled people. I love the example of the stage being accessible, because often it is assumed that, well, why would we have any disabled pastors or leaders or speakers? No, we lead. We have lots to teach. We have lots to share. We have gifts to share with the community, and those are diverse. So really learning from disabled people, and that can look like following disabled folks online, on social media, listening to the disabled people in your own communities. And of course, that assumes that you are already friends with disabled people. And that is sometimes unaware to people, that they haven't really had very much experience with disability because churches are not required to be accessible, because they fought against ADA and said we were too costly and it was infringing on religious freedom. So because of that, a lot of disabled people have been excluded from church. I've been in churches where there is no ramp, and when I ask for one, I'm told that's not stewarding tithe well. So just the idea of the space you're in needs to be accessible, and accessible to all different types of disabilities. I use a wheelchair, but of course there's many disabilities. And then the practices need to be accessible. If you have people coming up and holding folks down to pray for them without their consent, that's not accessible.
It's assault. That's abuse. I'm like, that's abuse.
It literally is.
It's assault.
So that's called assault. If your songs use ableist language, if you're constantly forcing folks to stand, and I'm not saying having an invitation where you can stand or you can move about, as you feel led or as you're abled. I'm saying if you're forcing people. I've been in church spaces where I can't stand, and so I'm stared at in sections of the liturgies where we're told to stand, or where we're invited to, or where you're just excluded from the practices of communion or various things because you can't move to the section of the sanctuary that holds those elements. So thinking about accessibility as an ethos, as a practice, as an ongoing negotiation and conversation, that you're never arrived. You're never going to be fully accessible. Access needs change from time to time. And as you have the ebb and flow of different community members coming in, you're going to have to reassess those access needs and what it means to be accessible. And in my experiences, most churches just don't really want to do that work, and nor are they legally required to.
I mean, they're tax write-off money. I mean, they're not taxed. They could take that money. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
well. Yeah, some studies estimate that the crip tax, which is the additional amount that disabled folks pay each year just for being disabled on mobility aids, medical, different types of accessibility, because the world is not made for us. Some studies estimate that that's an extra $10,000 to $30,000 per disabled person per year. So yeah, what would be great is if churches paid the crip tax for disabled people.
Wait a minute.
But of course, no, go ahead.
There's a tax, when you purchase something, is it an additional tax, or on your tax forms?
No, it's not on your tax forms. It's just the name that's given to the extra cost of being disabled.
Okay. Well, it wouldn't surprise me either way.
Exactly. Yes, that wouldn't surprise me either. But kind of like how the pink tax works, how any item, you can have two raises, and one can be marketed to women, and that therefore costs more. It's exactly like that.
Still ridiculous, still awful.
Absolutely. So just pointing out that churches could do a number of things with the money that they save being untaxed. And that could, of course, be one of them. But in order to do that, that would require a deep investment in disabled people. And unfortunately, most churches don't really have that.
Oh, my goodness. All of our churches there's so many Bible verses that you need to reread. I mean, I'm just saying.
Well, I'm very curious then. Do you still identify? You've had so much trauma. Do you still identify from within the Christian tradition? Kind of how has your spiritual journey gone alongside you throughout these years?
Yeah, I do. Because they don't get to take Jesus. And the they there is, anyone who has done me or other people harm, but also anyone who thinks that they own what Christianity is. And I think it's really important to me, although I have a lot of respect and space for people who land elsewhere, but it has been really important to me to reclaim some of the ableist practices and ideas that have been shoved onto me and reclaim what I think mutual flourishing actually looks like, which is that we all get to thrive and that disabled people are included in an accessible banquet, and that it isn't that my body is not a defect or a prayer request, but that it is divine.
Yes. Yes. I'm also just noticing, going back to the example that you talked about kind of having this relationship where you go to the laundromat and you're in fellowship with unhoused people. It strikes me that would take time to coordinate, to organize, to set up, and follow through. And earlier we were talking about capitalism. And so what I'm guessing, that's not going to be an easy thing to do, to break that cycle or that rhythm of the glorification of busy, to cultivate a new rhythm or way of being with each other. So yeah, what? Let's talk about that.
Yes.
Yeah, so what have you found in terms of what are people needing to hear in that regard as it relates to disrupting, divesting from the systems that glorify busy, that keep us disconnected and separated? Because in any struggle that I've seen, it takes time, it takes resource, it takes energy, it takes making it an intentional and a priority. So what are you, like, you're saying people have to get up and do something or move and do something?
I think we should all live by crypt time, which is this idea from Ellen Samuels and Alison Kafer that is suggesting that time isn't linear and it doesn't move forward or incrementally, but that disabled people move at a different pace and in a different type of cycle. So some days I can get out of bed by myself, and other days my husband helps me put on my socks. Some days I can have several meetings and talk to wonderful people on a podcast, and other days I can't do anything. And in both and all of those days, I'm no less worthy of care. I'm no less worthy of rest and of resources and of love. And I'm no less worthy of humanity and compassion. And of course we say that, and it's kind of in vogue now to talk about well-being and rest and self-care. And there's parts of that I find to be just toxic positivity and kind of suggesting that you can, through your own individualism and through your own money, often, and your own privilege, you can somehow undo the harms of toxic systems. And that's not what we're talking about with Crypt Time. It's an invitation to not live by clocks or calendars, but to actually listen to our bodies and to not shame or belittle that all of our bodies have needs and that all of those are worthy of being met.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
What an amazing world we would live in if we lived, because mentally our world is falling apart and we don't even see it.
I just have one final question, Amy. I don't even recall. I've got so many pages here. I'm not even sure which article this is tied to. But when I read this one paragraph, I wrote "what" in all capital letters in orange magic marker, and I just want you to elaborate on this a little bit. I fully believe you that this was a thing, but it says the so-called ugly laws on the books in the United States until the 1970s mandated that disabled people deemed unsightly must be hidden away. What?
Sigh. Yeah. Yeah. These ugly laws were, it basically said that anyone who was disabled or a long list of what were considered ugly were not to be out in public. And now, of course, we don't have formalized ugly laws, but we still practice them by the fact that when I go out in public, I am accosted, I am prayed for, I am assaulted, as was pointed out before. This idea that the public space is only for certain bodies and for what is deemed that kind of perfect body, thin, white, cishet, non-disabled. And while I think most of us learn about those ugly laws and, as you're saying, Olivia, say what? Or maybe some more choice words. I think we still really have those in effect in the ethos and mentality of the way people treat my body.
Mm-hmm. And it's another layer of supremacy culture.
Yeah.
Over and over again. And
yeah.
But what we're going to heal from is we got to know about it first, which is not your responsibility, but to learn and stop hiding, because our country's built on presentation.
Yes.
You look pretty, and the church follows that suit as well.
Yeah, presentation and performativity.
Yes.
And if you can, this is why I think crip theory is so helpful, because it works at the intersection of queer theory and disability studies. And it tells us that if you can perform heterosexuality and able-bodiedness, you are rewarded by the system. And that's harmful to a number of different groups, but it's also really harmful for who we allow to tell stories and take up space in the public sphere and what we consider normal. Even our ideas of normalcy are connected to ableism and to queerphobia.
Speaking of queer theory and its intersections, there's two things that were super impactful for me that has layers that I was able to sit with today in prepping for our conversation. But the bringing up this idea of normalcy in what we think of a normative relationship, right? You do two things. One, you talk about becoming mindful of the words that we're using in our everyday language and I've been doing some of that work now for the last couple of years, and I'm just noticing that it restructures the brain, but it doesn't just restructure the brain, it restructures relationships and how we're into relationships with one another. And so the idea, you kind of mentioned this earlier with your husband, but you wrote an essay talking about love and this notion of experiencing intimacy that I just thought was so poignant. But what might we need to hear as it relates to our language restructuring the brain and its effect on our relationships and intimacy?
That's such a good question. I, in that essay, talk about how when out in public together, My husband will often receive accolades from strangers of what a saint he is for being with a disabled person, as though our entire relationship is designed to entrap him. You know, that we actually have much more depth to our partnership and collaboration than just forcing him to be with a poor disabled person like me. And I think what that gets wrong, obviously it comments on something that's none of your business, but I think also, suggests that it's your right to tell us what you think of our relationship, which it's really not. But also, I think what it gets wrong is it doesn't understand what Mia Mingus calls access intimacy, which is this idea of when your access needs are met without complaint or confusion or without trying to belittle them, there's a deepening of intimacy there. And it can be, a sexual intimacy, a loving intimacy, a platonic intimacy. Intimacy happens across all relationships. And the beautiful thing about access intimacy is it values you for being a human being, and instead of what you can do or what your access needs are that day. A lot of times people say to me that it must be embarrassing or shameful to have my husband help me get dressed or do things that are considered excessive or extra. And that couldn't be further from the truth in my case. There's a deepening of access intimacy, of someone knowing exactly how you like your socks on, and the extra space that you like between your toes, and how warm you want the heat pack. And it goes directly against purity culture, which says that that's not how relationships, especially these heterosexual relationships, are supposed to function. That I am here to be submissive and a sexualized object for his pleasure, and instead really reverses that by deepening the intimacy between us through everything from helping me get dressed to just understanding my access needs. And if, of course, there are other relationships that I have that in as well, where people don't second guess or try to gaslight what my needs are, and people just meet them. And we can all have that with each other, particularly with something as simple as our language. If the only time we talk about disability is by calling something undesirable or cheesy, as is often the case when people say lame, which I am lame, then that's going to impact the way that we understand people, the way that we understand disabled people. It's not to try to change people's language itself, but to really dig deep to what the language means. The language is a repository for our bias. It reflects what we really think of disability. No one ever says, hey, that's lame, for something that's cool, I'm only brought up when it's something bad. And same with that was crippling or paralyzing. I have had temporary paralysis. I am crippled, and it doesn't feel great to be everyone's go-to explanation for a bad time.
Yeah, and one of the things that, again, that I encouraged people to kind of sit with what's coming up, but what in our ableist structure, the question that I kind of want to ask, it almost feels unfair, is like, how do we move through that? Like, because we're going to fuck it up.
Yeah, truly.
A lot.
Yeah. I think perfectionism is a tool of white supremacy and ableism, because it tells us that we can be perfect. And so even just the first phase of acknowledging we won't be perfect at this, we will mess up, and that's okay. It's how we mess up and how we recover and make amends that's important. People say ableist words or ableist phrases all the time. And when I say, oh, hey, that's not cool, I'm lame, please don't use that word, It's how they recover that is important to me. It's the difference between someone saying, oh, I'm so sorry, you're right, or, that's on me, my bad, versus someone saying, oh, it doesn't mean that anymore, or you're too sensitive, or take a chill pill, all of which I've been told to my face. I think changing our language, noticing our bias, making space for the times that we've gotten it wrong. All of us have been immersed in this ableist system. And so all of us have room to grow.
Yes.
Even disabled people, when it comes to becoming more inclusive with our language and our practices. And especially because disability is such a broad constellation of body minds, many of us have internalized ableism connected to ideas of intelligence or to ideas of worth that we've talked a lot about. And so really just noticing when we have those ideas, not shaming ourselves for having them, but naming it and trying to move beyond those ableist ideas.
There is so much potential as we embrace like crypt theory. You've given me more language tonight, especially with access intimacy. There's just so many tender memories firing off in my brain, but also some painful ones in which I did mess up. Like with nurses are, you would think that nurses know better, but often we can be some of the biggest perpetuators of ableism in making people feel unseen and harmed, especially in our medical industrial complex. So I'm experiencing such promise in this moment that these conversations are intersecting and talking, kind of building coalition again in this day and age.
I also just want to encourage our listeners and myself and all of us that this is not a place we are to arrive at. This is the journey we're on. There's our culture, our perfectionism, our capitalism teaches us that we accomplish things. And in the accomplishment, we stampede people. And so just want to encourage you all, like, this isn't an end goal. Learning to be in community is not a checklist.
Yeah. And it's messy.
Very.
And it takes humility.
Lots.
And when we first learn about really what we've talked about tonight, which is disability as a culture and disability pride, it can be really strange to people. And I would just say, don't let that stop you from continuing to grow and learn in this area.
Yeah.
And it's okay. Like, if you're recounting things that are in your mind of, like, don't get stuck in the, I should have done this. I should have done this. I should have done this.
Oh yeah. The inner critic.
Yes. You will be in that loop forever, because all of us, there's no exception, have those moments.
Yes.
And so don't let that eat you alive, but just learn. Like, going back to the humility, like what you were saying, Amy, the humility will draw us together.
What I'm noticing is that this is another invitation to break binary, right? To break the binary between able-bodied and disabled-bodied, to recreate how we exist on a day-to-day in a way that works for each and every single one of us. Because when we're honest, when we're truly honest, none of this shit is working for none of us right now.
Amen.
Yeah, and
created for
and you may join us one day in being permanently disabled.
Amen.
Through either age or accident. And even if you don't permanently, you will certainly have temporary disability. And there's so much when we're thinking about crip theory and that we have to perform that compulsory able body, that compulsory heterosexuality. We see that so much with toxic masculinity and ableism, don't we? Where someone throws out their back or has an off day with their knee, but they can't admit it because that's not, quote, manly. And then they end up hurting themselves more. And all of these systems just reinforce and perpetuate one another. But what if we created a structure and a world where there was no hierarchy of bodies and we didn't have to perform heterosexuality or able-bodiedness, and both of those ideas were just thrown away, and we admitted that every body mind has needs and has strengths and that those fluctuate over time?
Communities would flourish because people would be seen.
Yeah. And we wouldn't be stuck in trying to perform our worth or trying to perform some version of ourselves that doesn't exist. We end up harming ourselves more. We end up disabling ourselves in trying to perform this myth of the able body.
Ooh, you better come up on here and preach now. We end up harming ourselves. Ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth? I'm staring at my dad right now in my brain.
Aren't we all?
My dad is a beautiful 78-year-old human and is stubborn as all get up. And there's multiple factors that go into that stubbornness. But I just think about how so much of his identity has been tied to what he's been able to do with his body. And is hard watching him in his old age, as again, you know, at some point all of us will experience disability, whether permanently or temporarily. Watching him go through this process in a world that does not allow space for that. For marginalized bodies, Amy, I forgot who said the quote, but the quote that hope is a discipline. And for marginalized bodies, I feel like I'm thinking about Austin Channing Brown's book, I'm Still Here, when she talks about how hope dies. What is that relationship to hope for you? Like, are you hopeful? Do you have to be hopeful? Is hope dying and being reborn for you?
All of the above. Yeah, moment by moment. I think that fluctuates with our access needs. I have, in getting to talk with folks about the book and in the lead up to the book, I have had such hope because there's this inner healing, I think, that's happening for young Amy, who said so many of these things and was dismissed or silenced or told that I was too sensitive or I was causing division or I was letting the devil take a foothold. You know, things we've all heard before. So there is such hope for the fact that she finally gets to be listened to. And there's hope for other little Amy's and other people who get to catch moments of my story and hopefully then share their story and share what they want to see in terms of disability, inclusion, and justice, and how we can make space for more body minds. So the book is just my story. I can't represent all disabled people. You know, we're 26% of the US population and 15% of the global population. But I do have glimpses of hope that the book can invite some people, at least, to consider my story.
I'm in school for spiritual direction right now, and one of the when we first started, there was this question asked that came from the concept, I think, by a woman named Louisa Tisa, and I'm probably saying that name wrong, but it was this question of how will we add to the sacred orature of our time. And I'm just so grateful for the sacred orature that you are gifting to the world by sharing your experiences, sharing your wisdom. It's such a gift. And may it also be a call to action.
Yes.
Daily that we need as we work to transform our society. So I'm just so grateful for you.
Thank you. But it's really only through these conversations that happens. So it's all of us in concert together creating the symphony of equity.
Symphony of equity. I love that.
Yo, that was our show. Thanks for listening to Permission to Be. Thank you to our guests. So if you want more information, head on over to permissiontobepodcast.com to check out the show notes, get some more information on our guests that we post over there. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, leave a rating. If there's somebody that you want to see on this podcast telling their story, we also want to hear from you. So make sure to connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, Permission to Be Podcast, and we'll see you soon.